Great. Well, welcome everyone to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs in the first joint hearing that we've done with our colleagues in the Senate Government Operations Committee. And I think we're going to start with, since our committees have not met each other, with a brief round of introductions. So Senator Hardy, would you like to have your committee go first and then we'll.
Sure. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District and I'm chair of the Senate Committee.
Senator Tanya Vyhovsky from Chittenden Central, and I'm vice chair of the Senate Government Operations.
Senator Bob Norris, Franklin County.
Senator Ann Watson from the Washington District.
Allison Clarkson, Windsor County District.
Rebecca White, Windsor County District.
I'm Mike McCarthy. I'm the chair of House Gov.Ops and Military Affairs, and I'm from St. Albans.
Nat Byron, vice chair of this committee. I am from Virgins and I represent 6 communities in Northwest Addison County.
I am Representative Lucy Boyden. I represent District Memorial 3, which is Cambridge and Belleville.
Representative Lisa Hango, Franklin 5.
Michael Morgan, Great Isle Chittenden, which is all of Great Isle County and western corner of Milton.
Seth Chase, I represent Colchester.
Shay Waters Evans, Charlotte and Heidelberg.
Kate Nugent, a portion of South Burlington.
And our guests today from the Office of Racial Equity are here to present on the 2023 Language Access Report. So, Director Davis, I'll turn things over to you.
Buenas tardes. Para el récord, yo soy Susana Davis, la directora ejecutiva de Equidad Racial para el estado de Vermont. Estoy aquí con mi colega Jay Green.
Hola, me llamo Jay Green. Soy el analista de política en la oficina de Equidad Racial.
All right. Y hoy estamos aquí para hablar sobre el reporte que hicimos el mes pasado sobre acceso al lenguaje. Primeramente, la agenda de hoy es que vamos a empezar con el proceso y estructura del reporte y de nuestro proceso. Después vamos a discutir la participación de la comunidad. Después de eso vamos a hablar sobre las conclusiones y recomendaciones a que hemos llegado. Y al fin vamos a hablar sobre pasos siguientes y las cosas que nosotros recomendamos que ustedes hagan. Siguiente. ¿Hay un intérprete?
So I think that Director Davis, you may be illustrating for us the challenge of being in the situation of not understanding the language that a presentation that is official is being presented in. Am I?
So right. Fortunately, we will conclude the exercise.
That's why we were going to finish because we have it right here on our. And I understood.
We actually did make the Spanish version of the slides as well. The first two. I'm not doing all that. Okay, so yes, thank you for indulging us in that exercise. It's really important to us that we think about the ways in which communication happens at the micro level every single day and the ways in which it impacts you and your interactions. People like Jay and I are very privileged to be able to come here and have fluid, seamless interactions with you all in committee rooms, in hallways, and be able to say, oh, by the way, just have those by the way conversations all the time without needing to plan ahead for something like an interpreter. So with the slides in English, we'll begin again. Buenas tardes. I am Susana Davis, Executive Director of Racial Equity for the state. I'm here with my colleague, Jay Green. He's our policy and research analyst. Today, we're going to talk to you about the 2023 Language Access Report that we published last month. Every time I say that, I realize that saying the 2023 report implies there is a yearly report. In fact, this is the first and only one we've done thus far, though I will share in a few minutes how this really has been a multi-year process. So we're going to start by talking about the report structure and the process that we went through to get here. Then we'll talk a little bit about how the community engagement unrolled. And then we'll talk about findings and recommendations and then conclude with next steps. And of course, please do feel free to stop us along the way with questions as well. So process and structure, I am on, these are not numbered, I am on slide number 7. What you're looking at is a colorful bar. that shows the layout of the report, if you will. This is a 100-page report. Yes, there are 100 of those little rectangles on the slide. And what you'll notice is that based on how they're broken down, half of the report is appendices and references. We like to back up what we say. Yes.
I think that's page 4 on the one that's.
Yeah.
It is on ours.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, because I put my trick slides in. Thank you, Representative. So the report begins with an executive summary, which contains a summary and also a chart that contains all of the findings and recommendations. It also contains links to other places in the document, if you know what it is specifically you're looking for. It moves on to talk about the components of a good language access plan and the federal standards to which we must adhere. It then goes on to the findings and recommendations section, followed by a very long appendix and references section, and then a one-page infographic summary at the very end. I want to talk a little bit, I'm on my next slide now, number 5, about the process that we went through and some of the highlights. So we really want to begin, I want to begin with that 7 o'clock yellow piece, educate and recognize needs. We see that as a starting point that centers community. So having bilateral communication or bidirectional communication with communities about what are the needs with language access. We think we know what they are. I think I know what they are because of my lived experience, but you know what? Being a Spanish-speaking person in New York is very different than being a Kirundi-speaking person in Vermont, right? So being able to get experience from impacted communities, not assuming that we know best, even if we have some limited amount of lived experience. So we did a lot of really community-driven engagement. Most of the recommendations we're going to discuss today came directly from community members and other concerned individuals. We then kind of moved into a qualitative and quantitative research phase. Again, that's more fact-finding and more consultation with community and with providers. And that also included state government agencies. We had members of the legislature to whom we're extremely grateful, who were also participants in that process. We took back everything that we heard, packaged it up in a way that we think we got right, and then gave it right back to the same people and said, did we get this right? Took another couple of rounds of feedback. And then eventually came up with a plan for how we thought we could best implement. Now, that's kind of where we are in that yellow that's sloping down, that's about to be sloping downward. We're hoping to be able to agree between all 3 branches on a good policy moving forward so that we can move to implementation. At that point, we won't have just made it out of the woods, done and dusted. We're going to have to continue to monitor. We want to make sure that we get it right. We want to make sure that any tweaks or adjustments that need to be made can be made. And we want to make sure that we're continuing that feedback cycle with impacted populations so that we can keep refining and getting better and doing better. I want to talk a little bit about the milestones and the timeline. I said earlier that this process is years in the making. We did an initial survey of state agencies in 2020 just to get some baseline data about where we are in language access, how much do our agencies know about it, and how close to compliance are we. That process was interrupted by the pandemic, which really put a halt to a lot of things that were considered not mission critical. But I have to put a big asterisk on that because language access absolutely is mission critical. However, the way in which we had to address it really was from an emergency response perspective. That is to say, we had to put down the work of developing a comprehensive plan and instead focus on putting out the fires. I would like to have you all recall the situation that took place in Flint, Michigan, when it was discovered that the water was toxic and that the water was trying to kill people. People were notified of the health hazard and immediately had boil water notices, all kinds of other information and public health notices that were issued, except those Flint residents who didn't speak English, because they put out no notices in other languages. And so as a result, you had people living in that city, visiting that city, who were being exposed to toxic water for weeks longer than other residents. So when I say that our focus during the pandemic switched to mission critical and emergency response, for us, the focus really was on getting language access for those critical daily and weekly communications that were going out, things like school closings, any public safety notices, public health especially. But other than that, the broader work of making this a policy shift was put down temporarily. In session 2022, that work was reinvigorated with the introduction of 147, a bill pertaining to a language access plan. That bill was heard in the Gov.Ops committees and in Senate Gov.Ops. And it had been tabled at the time, pending our ability to regroup and come up with a recommendation. We took the summer and the autumn and half of the winter, and we did just that. In April, we held a convening session with a whole lot of people. That was one of our early rounds of community engagement. We took it back, did a little work on it, came back and reconvened them again in August, took back the second round of feedback, did some more with new people we hadn't heard from yet. And then from the autumn through now, we had that time just doing final research and drafting the report. And when I say we, I really mean Jay, who was the absolute research and drafting powerhouse of this whole thing. I'll pause there for questions.
I have like a million questions about how things rolled out during the pandemic, but I don't want to get us down a sidetrack. I don't want to hear anything. So I would say an overarching question was kind of how did we do in terms of identifying what were the critical pieces of information to get out during the pandemic and making sure that folks that speak different languages actually got access to those critical pieces of public information.
Yeah, not great.
Yeah.
Not great.
That's part of why we have the bill.
It took a lot of community intervention, a lot of advocacy, a lot of people coming together in ad hoc, informal groups to navigate the system, some of them for the first time, and really have to advocate for it. It was difficult. And again, everybody's life was on the line along the way. I think that there were very strong coalitions that emerged out of that work. Entities like the Vermont Language Justice Project and the interpreter task force that were put together by service providers and community members. But I think that the institutional trauma of how and why they had to form those coalitions in the first place definitely is something we don't want to have to see repeated again.
Senator Hardy.
Sure. Susanna, I actually wasn't on the Gov.Ops committee last year, so can you remind me, S-147 was introduced and heard, but it didn't pass. But essentially, was there an official ask for you all to do this report, or was it just sort of like, oh, we should get this report before we pass legislation?
It was heard. Testimony was provided by us, by the Human Rights Commission, by community advocates, and it was our recommendation that the committee consider tabling the bill until we had more time to complete the process that we had begun. They acquiesced to that request, and that's what we ended up doing for the remainder of the year.
Okay, so you offered to do the report basically, or said, we really need to do this report. We didn't.
We asked for
you to do it.
We asked for time to finish what we started.
Got it. Thanks.
And I will add one of the critical pieces of that was that the bill we thought was a really great start. But one of the things we noticed was that it focused very heavily on the executive agencies, but didn't really say much about any other branch of government. And we thought that for something to be truly statewide, we really had to work across all of the branches. And that was part of the reason that we thought it would be worth taking more time to really come up with something that was cohesive. Okay, so I will move us to slide number 8 and talk about community engagement. What you're looking at is a long list of entities we heard from, and we're extremely grateful to these entities. You'll see a lot of state government agencies. You're seeing community organizations, members of state-created advisory panels. We got a lot of feedback. These are not shy people. And so having the opportunity to hear from this group was really important because this is a group that's comprised of people with lived experience, people who immigrated to this country, either under refugee status or other statuses or no status, people who work for the state, people who are members of professional associations. It was a very, very broad sweep. It included people from legislative operations departments, really helping us understand what is it going to take first of all, what is needed? And second of all, what's it going to take to get there? We had varied feedback methods. Slide 9 will show you 2 of the ways in which we collected feedback over that period of months. We did some voting exercises, a multi-vote exercise that feels a little bit like runoff voting. We also collected feedback through a web form that we had open for months. We visited with advisory panels, including the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Systems Advisory Panel, and had a lot of great feedback from that group. And then we also, of course, held those 2 large convenings, which were, the first one was hybrid. So people were able to join via Zoom or also in person. And we had sign language interpreters available as well, and interpreters for any other language upon request, but we didn't get requests for other languages. The second convening also had ASL interpretation available. We didn't get requests for additional languages. That one was fully remote. What we heard from the community, you'll see summarized on slide 10. Some of the things that were highlighted as strong values included wanting to feel welcomed, wanting to feel like people belonged, having high quality options. In other words, not just having any old body give you something translated, but being able to choose from a selection of qualified individuals or services. Valuing grassroots organizations who have been advocating for years about this topic in Vermont. Valuing the force that relevant laws can and do have in making sure that compliance is attained. Valuing the website and building accessibility so that when we think about language access, we're also thinking about people who speak or sign non-spoken languages, and also just the technological capability of being able to access something on the web in your own language. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And then, of course, having reliable and complete data, not only so that we know who's here and what is the uptake for services, but also how are we communicating other data that may not have to do specifically with language access to communities who speak more languages than English. We had a lot of open questions as well, things that people wanted to know. For example, where should this work sit? What is the optimal technology? Are there certain platforms that are better than others? How do we make the best use of the tech that we have as a state? Can state funding be used to support some of the coalitions that have been created? How do we grow the interpreter and translator profession? How do we lower silos across agencies? And then some of the things that we heard very clearly that folks wanted included seamless access, quick access, so that if someone plops down in front of you and starts speaking in a language you don't speak, we know how to do that. If they didn't put in their request for an interpreter 2 days prior with the committee assistant, you know what the protocol is then. Accurate and quality product. Not every multilingual person can be a translator, just like not every quantum physicist can teach school science, right? You need people who have specialized training. You need people who can step away when there's a potential conflict of interest. And you need people who have a regional specific understanding of certain nuances that are specific to Vermont, right? To be able to not just go across a culture barrier or a language barrier, but also really get at those regional nuances. More spaces to be able to have conversations like these, reliable support of community organizations, clear minimum standards, which is one of the things we're hoping to establish here. And then they also wanted predictable budgeting, predictable forecasting of budgets so that we don't have to feel like our access to services is precariously hanging in the balance and being pitted against other important programs. So I will move to the findings. This is a really lengthy section, so I'll pause again for questions or thoughts.
I think we're dying to know the findings. So.
Well, there are a lot of them, and we've organized them in a way that we hope makes sense. First, I'll give you the super summary. We're on page 12. If you could only take away 4 things from this, if you tune me out for the remainder of our time together, I'll be comfortable knowing you at least remember the 4 following things. Number 1, any program receiving federal funding must provide language access services. This is not optional. There are federal civil rights laws on point to this. So when we talk about supporting, funding, and resourcing language access for state government, this isn't a wish list. This is so that we don't have to deal with the embarrassment of having a consent decree imposed on us. I don't want that on my watch. Number two, there is a cost to this. Translation services are not cheap. Translation services are not free. Access to communication, access to information is valuable. If it wasn't valuable, you wouldn't have to find paywalls at every news article you try to read, right? Access to information is important, and so being able to translate that information should be a valued and respected profession. So one of the first steps for us to being able to provide meaningful language access for the people in the state means translating vital documents. Now, I'm not using the term vital loosely here. This is a defined type of document. We'll talk a little bit more about what it means, but we estimate the initial cost for translating vital documents that the state has to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 million. We see that as a one-time cost to translate existing vital documents based on our assessment of how many there are and their complexity. And then beyond that 3.5, we see an ongoing expenditure of up to $790,000 per year, forever. But we give that estimate with the caveat that we are still operating on our best guesses and estimates. And for that reason, the amount may not reach $790 a year. This was a comfortable estimate that we arrived at that incorporated some of our larger agencies and departments and our smaller ones that may not really have much many public-facing materials. The third takeaway, the third pre-tune-out takeaway is any conversations around language access absolutely must include considerations of accessibility and disability. They're inextricably linked. We can't talk about having a button that says translate this on a website without acknowledging that, for example, people of color are more likely to access the internet using mobile phones or tablet devices. Are our websites mobile friendly? Are they tablet friendly? Is that button even working, right? We also know that being able to translate text that's on a website as a block of text versus text that's contained in an image is very different, right? Having alt text on an image, especially if it's a screenshot of a document itself. These are all considerations having to do with accessibility and disability that also impact whether and how easily we can translate things into other spoken languages as well. The last pre-tune-out takeaway is going to be uniqueness. Vermont, our journey with language access is going to look different than that of our neighbors, mainly because the languages most commonly spoken in this state are not necessarily a comparable list to those most commonly spoken in our surrounding states. In a previous life, I worked in a jurisdiction where this was easy. It was Spanish, French, Polish, Italian, maybe some Portuguese in there, right? We had a clear list and a huge chunk of the city spoke those languages. So we could find these services and we had a defined audience. It's a lot more difficult when you have a set of languages that are commonly spoken in our small state, but not as commonly spoken in the broader US. It means that as we think about contracting for some of the services that we're going to need in order to make this work, we would like to focus on Vermont-based translators and interpreters. And also, it's a small pool. Capacity is limited. We want to support and grow that capacity. And yet, we also have to be prepared for the likelihood that we may have to lean on national vendors who can fulfill any additional need that we may have. Again, that's not our preference, but it's something that we have to be able to keep in mind to make sure that we're in compliance with all federal and other laws.
One thing, can I just quickly define interpretation?
Please do, yeah.
So one thing that I was actually not aware of when I joined the Office of Racial Equity last February and started learning about this project was that there's a difference between interpretation and translation. Interpretation is communicating the meaning of spoken or signed languages between people who are communicating with each other. And there are different types of interpretation. The report has links to more definitions of the different types of interpretation. Translation is the process of communicating written materials from one language to another. And in the case of signed languages, you need to take that written document and make a video of someone signing the words in that document. So that is still translation because you're taking a pre-recorded piece of media and translating it into another language. So I also, when I say translation, I also mean like translating the captions of a video from one language to another. Yeah.
Thanks, Jay.
Senator Platt.
May have just answered my question, but I know that some of the, at least one of the somewhat commonly spoken languages in the state isn't a written language, it is only a spoken language. So would that translation be to video?
Yeah, we would, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, so yes, so some folks in the state speak Mai, which is an African language for, I believe, Central Africa, which doesn't have a written form. And one thing that people can do to make translation happen for people who speak Mai is to read a document and make an audio recording of it. So that's a good way to help people who speak Mai.
Representative.
Can I read back to what I just think I heard? Interpretation is a live interaction and translation is a static? Like a video, but the video doesn't change?
I want to say yes, but there are a lot of different types of interpretation. I think the important thing is that interpretation is for interpersonal communication and translation is for media, documents, captions on a video. I think that's the more useful distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe you've got it further in your slideshow, but I'd be interested, was there any community feedback, from the non-English speaking individuals looking for access to learn English? I mean, was there that, and is there money set aside for that as well?
There was a healthy discussion around English language learners and being able to access courses. Our office, our other staff person who focuses on education and outreach, she's been joining me in conversations with some of the local higher ed institutions to talk about some of the ways that we could expand course offerings or find more people to be able to support with those. I think that this is an incredibly important conversation, and it's one that we have to have with an eye toward our broader demographic goals. We want to attract and grow, we want to attract people to the state and grow the population. And I think that the issue you're raising really goes hand in hand with that because it touches on people's job prospects, where people are going to live. Residency patterns for people often really do rely on where you can communicate with people. So the short answer is yes, there was definitely discussion about that.
We're good for now. Thank you.
All right. So, when I think about access in general and language access, the why is important for us to keep in mind. People who have language limitations, for example, people who speak only English with no other languages, are vulnerable in this increasingly multicultural world. And so being in a place where you don't speak the dominant language, especially if that language is as complex as English, a lot of resentment toward the mechanics of the English language. It means that the challenges that you're going to experience are super hard. We're talking about access to things like schools, school services. And the point that I wanted to get at here is that interpretation and interpreting is a skill. And there are certain context-specific forms of interpretation that require even more advanced levels of training. Some of those contexts include medical translating, legal translating, and school setting translating. So having a person who's accustomed to, or interpreting rather. So having a person who's accustomed to doing paper translations may not necessarily be well suited to interpret for a student in a classroom because it requires a certain kind of skill set. So we're going to talk about some of our findings and you'll notice that there are a lot of nuances because it's really not one big bucket. In the same way that you have specialties across the medical field, you also have specialties across interpretation and translating. So we are on page/slide number 13, findings section. There are 17 of these slides. You will see waypoint dots on the right side to let you know how close to the end we are. I'm going to go through these really quickly because there are many of them. So I'll gloss over them, but please stop me when you want us to expand. We've numbered our findings in a way that we think makes sense. So you'll see number dot letter. Each one of those may have multiple recommendations associated with it, and some of them give an option recommendation in either or. All right, so first we're going to begin with the ones having to do with the topic of what we've titled values, framework, and culture. These are the recommendations, these are the findings that really get at our approach, our general ethos around language access as a state. The findings here are that the state of Vermont doesn't have a unified value statement regarding language access, and that language service providers' work is often undervalued and uncompensated. It's really cute in those police dramas on TV where they get a delivery guy to come in and translate for an interrogation, but really it's pretty unethical if you have options for not doing that. And again, not every multilingual person can be a translator. And so in certain circumstances, again, when your freedom or your health are at risk, those are the kinds of situations that we really want to avoid, right? So making sure that the work is valued and compensated, and making sure that the state has a unified and clear stance on language access. What we've recommended is drafting and publicizing a values statement that state government is committed to language access, and requiring agencies to adopt a model minimum plan. We have a draft. We'll come to that later. The next set of findings is under the category of data evaluation and reporting. First finding is that the state agencies are going to have unique needs for being able to implement a language access plan, that the details of each agency's plan is going to have to vary by time period and by agency. Our recommendations on this were to require state agencies to file their language access plans with the Office of Racial Equity, and to require agencies to review and revise those plans on a regular interval. Our recommendation is once a year for the first 5 years, and then once every 5 years after that. The reason we've set that recommendation up in that way is because we believe that in the initial period, we'll still be identifying the need, we'll still be evaluating which languages are being taken up more, which services are being utilized more. And as we gather more refined data on those topics, we'll be able to more accurately plan for budgets, plan for where to allocate things, and plan for perhaps which language groups we need to be focusing on more. So a yearly evaluation of every plan followed by once every 5 years, we think is a fair way to balance the fact that our state is very small against the fact that we're also talking about critical services, and you don't want to have to do this, once every, like we're not doing it with the census, right? That's way too long. So we see that as a good in between. Going to move us to the next slide. We're on 14. Eventually, I'm going to get tired and ask you to take over. Yeah, great. We're still in data evaluation and reporting. We're on finding 2B. Tracking expenditures and evaluating the programmatic needs is going to be tough based on current billing practices. Usually, when we get invoices for these kinds of services, they don't usually specify the languages in which services were provided or the type of language assistance that was provided. So what that means is that we're recommending that we train state employees on how to use different accounting codes and how to lay out or mark up invoices so that we can go back and say, okay, it wasn't just translation for an hour, but it was, we had 2 signers doing ASL in the same meeting for that hour. Or we had, 3 hours of interpretation for this specific language, right? And being able to track that makes it a lot easier for us to know where the expenditures are going instead of having to guess. We also recommended finalizing cost estimates for translation of vital documents at the programmatic level. So we have an overarching estimate of what we think it'll cost to translate the state's vital documents. But again, these are estimates, and really to get a refined number, we're going to want to go to the programmatic level and say, does this feel right by the time it trickles down? And then, of course, we're going to recommend tracking any costs that are related to that process, and any costs that are related to translating our additional vital documents into other languages. Basically, we think we know how much it's going to cost, but please save your receipts because that way we'll know for the future. Next one, there are limited data available to help us quantify the number of people in Vermont who speak or sign languages other than English. And I'm going to pause here because you'll notice that it's worded as people in Vermont. It's very often the case that we think that the work that we do as government is only aimed at people who live here, but this is absolutely a residents plus visitors issue, right? It's one thing to be unfamiliar with the language in the place you live. It's another thing to be unfamiliar with the language in an entirely different state with no cell coverage, right? So people in Vermont really is the way that I would like us to think about this, because we're also thinking about people who may not be familiar with Vermont culturally or organizationally. So we have limited data to help us understand how many people are in the state at any given time speaking languages that are not English. So our recommendation is to require that all state entities maintain records of what kind of language services we're providing and what languages those are being provided in. Next page, we're now into a new category called operations and staff protocols. Do you feel like taking over?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning just a brief definition of what a vital document is. And there's several pages of the report dedicated to this, but the brief definition that I have written in the report is that vital documents are public-facing and non-confidential documents of significant importance to clients of a program or government service. There are some examples of vital documents listed, which are informed consent forms and complaint forms, program intake forms, written notices of eligibility criteria, rights, denial, loss, or decrease of benefits and services. So I think that gives you kind of a general idea of what we're talking about.
License application.
Yes, that's a great example. Yes, there was, I won't get off track. So yes, so let me switch. I was doing a lot of the research on the Vital Documents project, so it's very easy for me to get off track there. So operations and staff protocols. This is a fairly lengthy section of the report because it is really important that we are digging into how the state provides language access services to all of the people who are living or visiting Vermont. And there were a lot of great recommendations from the community and from other state employees about how to do this in the most culturally competent way and the most respectful way. Also some great sort of operational recommendations from some of the background research that we did. For finding 3A, a lot of the folks who were state of Vermont employees who came to our convenings let us know that they don't currently have adequate staff capacity or monetary resources to actually follow the federal regulations for language access plans. And based on the conversations, there are people in the community who speak or sign languages other than English who would be using state services, but currently use the services that they're eligible for because they don't have good language access. So that utilization of services and language access services in particular is likely to increase once state agencies do a better job of publicizing the availability of free language access services. And that's free to the person who is requesting the services, obviously not free to state agencies.
I think Senator Clarkson has a question.
Can I just ask a check? What is the difference between a vital record and a vital document? Because
vital records are, to my knowledge, I believe that those are either personal health information. Are you referring to
mostly birth certificates and death certificates and vital record, because those are also public facing to some degree. And so I think we want to make sure we include vital records and vital documents.
So I don't think it makes sense to translate like an individual person's birth certificate. Like if you wanted to translate the form that explains what a birth certificate is, that would be great information for a parent giving birth in Vermont to know, no matter what language they speak. Like that information, like what happens when you go to the hospital to give birth, that would be great information for the Vermont Department of Health to work on translating. But the individual form itself, maybe not. Go ahead.
Senator Watson.
So thank you. I just want to, wondering about the services that are provided. So let's say somebody needs to fill out a form. Do you anticipate that this would mostly be the kinds of services like someone helping someone else fill out the form, or is it both translating the form into a different language and then also, so they would fill it out in a different language and then it get their answers being retranslated, like how does that work?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with the Department of Motor Vehicles about that specific topic. And what they said is that they usually take the translated forms, like the application for a driver's license, and someone who speaks another language will work with a translator to, they'll fill out the form in their language, and then the translator will make sure to copy that information into an English language form, and then the English language form gets submitted back to the Department of Motor Vehicles. So that right now, language assistance providers usually work with people to make sure that forms are submitted in English, even if the person is using a copy of the translated form for their reference while they're filling it out.
But we wouldn't keep the form in their language.
We would keep blank copies of the form that we can distribute to people who need it to understand what they're filling out.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, also, if someone did submit a translated form that was in another language, we could send it to one of the state contracted language service providers and say, hey, someone just submitted their driver's license application in Arabic. Can you please translate this back into English for us? And they would help us do that. So the state does have resources that if we do get a form that's submitted in a different language, we can get it translated back to English if we need to.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also the Department of Motor Vehicles said that, sometimes it's fairly easy because the form, where it shows your name and your it's going to be the same line on both, on the English form and the translated form. My apologies, Susanna has reminded me that the chair is in charge of calling on members of the audience to have.
We're all in new ground with this, the senators, a whole nother, I have enough issue just making sure the members of my own committee get called on when they're in my peripheral vision, so I'm trying to make sure. So Jay, thanks for your help.
My second.
I'll try to stay on top of it.
Thank you. Excellent. So I was just going over 3A operations and staff protocols. Yes, so the folks who were from state agencies let us know that they don't have the adequate resources to implement the federal requirements for language access plans and language access services. So the recommendation that came out of that conversation, there are a few recommendations that are all under finding 3A. Evaluate whether there's additional need for staff, additional positions to be created to support language access implementation. For everyone for every operations staff person, there should be at least one primary state employee who's in charge of language access at each division or office level entity, and there should be a secondary person to be the point of contact in case the first person is on vacation or out sick, whatever. We recommend that the governor's office and the state legislature permit agencies and bodies to request additional staff positions if it's related to language access, and permit agencies to exceed the level funding of the budget requests if the requests are related specifically to vital document translation and other language access services. So the level funding cap is that the governor usually doesn't want state agencies to exceed more than, is it 3% of their past year's?
There's a sort of internal calculus to what is considered responsible regular budget increases. And so the thinking behind this is that for certain kinds of operations or activities that we could, that we would consider allowing for additional funding that may or may not exceed the requesting agency's budget otherwise.
So I'll just pause for questions because that was a long list of recommendations from that one topic, that one finding.
Senator Clarkson.
speaking of the governor's parameters of life for the administration, has this budget request, the 3.5 million, been included in the governor's budget?
The governor's recommended budget includes a line item for 2.3 million to cover a first phase of this one-time vital document translation work. It's unclear to us yet how long exactly it will take. Again, we mentioned that we want to prioritize in-state providers. And those in-state providers do have, we want to acknowledge limitations in capacity. So the governor's recommended budget includes this as a $2.3 million ask to get phase one completed. So we would need to strategize which portions of it.
So it's clearly going to take more than 1 year.
It's definitely going to take that, yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Let me jump back in.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, go for it.
So we're still in operations and staff protocols, still on page number 16, finding 3B, which is that state agencies don't uniformly distribute information about how to access free language services. So when we mail out a notice that says, hey, we saw you going through a speed trap, or hey, here's some other essential information that you need to know, there should be included with that notice something that says, by the way, if you can't read this, here's how you can get access to this being translated for free. So our recommendation here is to include that information in a way that is uniform and consistent across state government in any mailed or electronic communication. Next, we are on findings 3C, D, and E, all still under operations and staff protocols.
Mr. Chair. Thank you.
-8.
So it related to that last point, but I think it's relevant to a number of recommendations. How did you reconcile both language barriers because people aren't native English speakers or aren't proficient in English, and then also just literacy barriers? So people may not be able to even read at a high level in their own native language. So how do we reconcile that? I was just thinking they might not be able to read in English that says go to this website to get a free translation.
Correct. And that's why when we recommend notices of free language access services, that they always be written in the language of the translated language being offered. So in other words, the phrase, click here to read this in Arabic, should be written in Arabic, right?
What if they're not proficient in Arabic enough to read that? You know what I mean?
So an alternative is that we could provide audio or video. For example, one of the things that is commonly done when we need to get notices out really fast is large WhatsApp groups, to be honest. And that way you can do an audio recording or a link to a video. We know that the Vermont Language Justice Project has a lot of videos on their website. They've worked with the Healthcare Advocates Office and with others to get important notices out over the last couple of years. And so a lot of those do take video form, which helps particularly for those languages that may have non-spoken versions.
Yeah, and the full report has actually later in this presentation, there are some findings related to that as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
So, oh, sorry.
Representative Chase.
Perhaps it comes up later. How do you identify what languages, like there's like 7,000 languages around, how do you choose which ones?
Yeah.
Did I miss that or is that?
There are more than 34 languages spoken and signed in Vermont. And we have made a cautious recommendation about which ones to look at, largely based on refugee resettlement data. We know what languages people speak when they have come through in some sort of a formal process like the refugee resettlement program. So that's where some of our strongest data come from. But we also know, for example, we have a very large community of people who are Spanish speakers who are often rendered invisible in other kinds of population counts because of immigration status. We know that we have people who request languages frequently in different settings. For example, in conversation with Justice Waples a couple of years ago, she informed me that in the courts, Chinese is one of the most commonly requested languages for interpretation, even though it's not considered among the top languages spoken in the state of Vermont. But in the court system, it's highly critical that we have it. So we have a recommended list of tier 1 and tier 2. And I say that with asterisks because I don't want to imply hierarchy or importance, but we have a set of languages that we think we should be ready to translate those or always have those ready. And then a second set of languages that we're referring to as tier 2, but I really would like to find a different way to describe that, that's additional languages as well.
Representative Byron.
So I have a question kind of in that vein. So are considerations taken for regional sort of subdialects within languages? I mean, like Spanish, for example, you have Castilian, you have Caribe, you have Central American, South American. They're functionally the same, but operationally different.
So what we wanted, yes, this is one thing that came up with the discussion around Mandarin, Cantonese, simplified, and traditional Chinese.
Think of that, yeah.
So because we are still a very small state with a small population of people who do speak languages that are not English, we're looking for baseline utility and simplification right now until we build up the base and the population and the providers who can really make it more robust and have those offerings. So what we have recommended is having a steady set of languages we know we're going to want to have translations in, and then upon request, if there are other options or other dialects or regional differences that need to be accounted for, then people can request those and we can find a way to accommodate them.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
All right. So we've got the next finding. Some people who speak or sign languages other than English are not aware that the state has to pay for these services. A lot of people think you have to BYO interpreter. So our recommendation, of course, is to make sure that people are aware that not only is this a service we can provide, but that it is free to them. Next one is that vital documents are not routinely translated. And so our recommendations here are to identify all the vital documents across all three branches. We've done a substantial amount of that work so far. And then to track the expenditures that are related to keeping those documents up to date, just so that we know it's not just enough to say, hey, we're going to spend $3 million to go and translate all of these one time. But if we update this form in the future, then that translation becomes moot. So being able to track the expenditure of maintaining it over time. We're on 3E now. Some vital documents may be too long or too technical even after they've been translated. So some of these, I mean, if you try to, if you showed me a tax form in English, I wouldn't know what I was looking at. I wouldn't know what I was reading, right? So even if you've translated into a person's language, if the document is, if the content itself is too technical, it might as well still be in a different language. So we're recommending creating plain language summaries of documents that are either very long or very technical before translation to ensure that the translated information is still relevant and accessible. And the idea behind a plain language summary is that you don't lose the meaning. You may shorten or condense the content, but people aren't losing any of the important portions or the meaning of it.
Representative Waters Evans, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. So when how are you going to keep track of if they change a document in the, tax department? Is there a database where they're going to log that they've updated a document and then?
So that can be pretty simple. I mean, we've already identified what we believe to be most, if not all, of the documents that would be considered vital documents in state government. So at that point, we have that list, we have it by department. And so, this part of this goes to the recommendation we had earlier about having everybody file their language access plan with us, and then we review it every year. So that might be, hey, you know what? These are the 10 documents we identified for you that are vital. Have you updated these in the last year? If so, did you translate it? If not, how many weeks are you going to take to get this done, right? So that could be a very simple way to track that. I'm sure there are also sophisticated platforms that we could use that put a little red dot next to something that's been updated. But I think a process that flows through whatever coordinating entity there is who's looking at all this, for that entity to say, okay, I know where all the vital documents are across state government, and I'm pinging them regularly to make sure that they're not getting updated.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
That would be one approach. The approach that's recommended in the report, in the longer detailed version of the report, is that the same as having one person who's a point of contact for any requests for language services that come into a department or office, is to make sure that the leadership in that department or office says, okay, team, this is the person who is responsible for keeping track of vital documents in our office or our department or division, whatever is the smallest subdivision of a state agency. Just making sure, it's a lot of it is just accountability. It's just making sure that there is a team of people who are regularly checked in with and held accountable for keeping the vital documents up to date. And that would be, yearly for the, go along with that yearly for the first 5 years and then, every 5 years. But I think that the vital documents should probably remain, and there are software tools that you can use to automatically notify you if something gets changed in a document, for example. So I hope that helps clarify.
All right. So we are up to 18 now. You're doing great. We're still in operations and staff.
100 pages, sure.
We're still in operations and staff protocols. These findings state that we can better utilize our software so that if we're interacting with a client, let's say I'm part of the 3 Squares program, and I know that I have a client and the person's in my record management system or case management system. If that person requires interpretation or translation to be able to engage with us, we can have something that puts a tick next to that person's name that says, hey, before you schedule a meeting with this client, make sure that you arrange for an interpreter so that you don't find out on the day of, oops, we got to reschedule. So this recommendation is to audit all of our record management software systems for their ability to be able to do that kind of thing, to say, put a little I next to it for interpreter or something like that. And also to configure our record management software to alert people to arrange for interpretation ahead of time, which saves everybody time. Our next finding is that most state employees only speak English, which is absolutely a barrier to language access. This is one of the reasons that we repeatedly say representation matters, not in a tokenistic way, but just because it does. So in public-facing offices, we're recommending the utilization of I Speak cards, which are visual cards that a person can use to identify which language they speak. We're also recommending a standard list of yes or no questions in Vermont's most commonly spoken languages that you can ask people as well in their language. So for example, if normally you would walk into DMV and maybe the first 3 questions they ask you is, do you need a new license? Or has your mailing address changed or something like that? You can have those standard yes, no questions written in different languages. And that way you quickly understand what the person needs or kind of get that basic stuff out of the way. And we're also recommending an electronic version of that with a tablet or some other device with a person who's signing those same yes, no questions in ASL so that the person in front of you who may sign ASL can also be able to participate in that. The other recommendation we have here is training state employees to use those I Speak cards and knowing the protocol for when a person walks in, maybe there may be identified a language barrier. You can quickly, where the cards are, how to use them and what to do next. You will note as we're going through these that a lot of these are easy and fast and inexpensive changes that we could make today if we wanted to. Still in operations and staff protocol, we're now on page 19. Multilingual state employees who are interpreting as part of their jobs may encounter conflicts of interest or other ethical or privacy concerns in doing that work. So our recommendation here is to prioritize using the services of dedicated and trained interpreters from our vendors instead of multilingual staff stepping in. We also know that there's no standard, and we're going to come back to multilingual staff as well. Actually, in the next one, there's no standard procedure also for measuring the capacity of those multilingual staff, right? You heard me speaking another language earlier. You have no idea if I knew what I was doing, right? So having a standard procedure for how we measure the competency of translation or interpretation capability for state staff should match what we're expecting from our vendors. And also, there's not a standard procedure for compensating multilingual staff who are expected to translate as part of their jobs. Many of us just do it because we always have, whether it's for family and personal circumstances or in the workplace when a client walks in and you happen to be the only person there who's from Burundi, right? But having a time reporting code for staff who are expected to step in and translate as part of their jobs is important to pay people for their labor. And also when you are hiring employees, if they're going to be expected to do a particular job and then also translate, that should be reflected in what in their salaries. Similarly, if you hire a person with a certain compensation package and then start leaning on them to do that translation, you should be revising what you're paying the person because you've now added a new duty. So that's kind of the whole recommendation around that. You want to take back over?
Sure. So we're on the last finding and recommendation for operations and staff protocols, which is just 3J. Because of the small number of people who speak other languages than English, speak or sign, not all of our state employees actually get to practice what happens in that scenario when someone walks into your office and says, I don't speak English, I need an interpreter, or says that in their own language, not in English. So the recommendations that we have are related to helping our state employees actually practice more, so that they can become skilled at requesting language access services when they need it. So the recommendations are for accountability purposes, leadership should identify which state employees should be in charge of making sure those training recommendations are met. We should use kind of secret shopper programs. So have someone who is multilingual go into an office and basically pretend not to know English and ask for services in the language that they speak and give a grade or an evaluation of the service that they receive, and pay them to do so because they're providing an essential service. They're providing training services and testing services for our state employees. And then if a state employee is not able to give language access services to the person in a timely and respectful way, support them with additional training. We don't want this to be like a punitive experience. This should be a learning experience for everyone involved. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to technology and resources? Great. Okay, so that is the wrap up of operations and staff protocols. There is a great deal more detail in the long form report that you can reference if you wish to review it. So for technology and resources, these are all recommendations that are related to things like our state of Vermont websites, any emails that we send out, electronic communications, public service announcements, emergency communications, anything that is, related to technology. And so the first finding is 4A. State websites frequently do not provide links into translated documents or information about the availability of language assistance in really obvious and easy to access places. A lot of websites that we investigated that notice about language access services will be at the very bottom of the page, and it'll say notice of language access services in English, and then it'll list a few languages below that. It's like, well, if someone doesn't know if someone can't read English and they just see notice of language access services, that doesn't mean anything to them. So there should be a notice of the availability there should be a notice of the availability of language assistance on every state website in a easy to read, obvious place. Those notices should include a video notice that is in American Sign Language or ASL. And anytime that you have a website, a link that you click on to navigate to a different page where there's a translated document, always display that link in the language that it's translated into. So as Susanna mentioned earlier, if you have, driver's license application that's in Spanish, display the link to that says, driver's license application en español. And I should be practicing my Spanish more. I managed to introduce myself, but I couldn't do that in my head.
All right.
So next one.
All right. I'm going to take over from here.
Great.
So we're still on technology and resources. We are on page 21 for those of you following along. So in most cases, state websites are only available in English. If they are translated, they're usually using a Google Translate drop-down button. Google Translate, we heard loud and clear from our community input that Google Translate is whack. It is insufficient, and it often creates error. We all know that it creates errors, but some of them really can make a big difference in people's outcomes. So our recommendations are as follows. Number one, create a mechanism through which people can request translated versions of our websites. Any links that we have to information about that should be displayed in their languages. Second, if we are using Google Translate, make sure that we put a disclaimer that's very obvious in multiple languages that says, hey, Google Translate is the thing that's right here on the corner here. Please know that it's going to create errors, and that if you want this website translated into or this page translated, you can contact us and here's how to do it. The next recommendation here is to include information about how to request interpretation services. And then the last one is all notices about language access services have to say that the services are provided at no cost to the person requesting. Moving on to the next page, we're on findings 4C and 4D. We are still in technology and resources. We know that similarly, complaint pages on state websites are all in English, which makes it really hard for people to let us know if we're doing a good job. So we're recommending creating videos in the recommended languages for notices of language services, translating complaint pages into more languages, and using state contracted interpreters to facilitate communication between the complainant and the state employees. Some complaints are really time sensitive, and we may not have a 2-week turnaround time to get an email or a document translated back to the person. So being able to have our vendors on call to say, hey, you know what, this is an urgent matter that was brought to our attention. We need somebody to step in. That's going to be really important. Related to this is also people who sign non-spoken languages. So we know that state websites are rarely formatted to be able to be accessed by phone or tablet. Our recommendations here are auditing all of our websites in their mobile and tablet versions to make sure that they're usable in English and usable when translated into other languages. And then completing a disability accessibility audit every time we make changes to our websites.
And the full report has a list of resources about how to do disability audits and companies that do them. And there's a website checker tools.
We are now on 23. The finding is that most state-created public service announcements and emergency communications are created in English without translated audio or captions. Remember Flint, Michigan. So our recommendations here are to create public service announcements and emergency communications with manually translated captions if it's video, not auto-generated, and with video or audio readings in Vermont's most commonly spoken languages. We're also recommending that we create emergency communications and PSAs in video format just to improve access for people who are not literate in their native language, and to use open captions in English in addition to closed captions, we'll define those momentarily, to assist hard of hearing and late deafened people who may not be familiar with the technology and accessing captions. Yep. Jay, would you do us the honor of explaining the difference?
Yes, so open captions are, so usually when you want to see closed captions on, let's say, a YouTube video, you go to the bottom right-hand corner of the video and you click on the little button that says CC, and then you can choose what language you want the captions to appear in. Some people don't understand how to do that, especially if you may be not super familiar with how video players work. And so closed captions are always included, but you have to select the option to display them on screen. Open captions are just always displayed on the screen. They're embedded in the video file itself. But it's important to have both closed and open captions, because the closed captions give you the option of switching between different caption languages. And they're also the way that Braille readers work to help people who are deafblind or deaf plus to read captions on a Braille display surface. And channeling one of our key partners in this whole project, the director of deaf, hard of hearing and deafblind services at Dale. Not everyone who is deafblind or deaf disabled can read Braille, but it is an important note.
Yeah. All right.
Jay, could I just ask a clarifying question? So Braille readers will display in Braille what's in the closed caption on a YouTube video?
Yeah.
Set up appropriately?
Yeah, it's really cool technology. Really, really cool. Yeah.
All right, you're gonna love the next one. Finding 4F, the three branches of state government each use different video conferencing platforms, which creates a lot of inconsistency and headache. The executive branch uses Teams, the legislative branch uses Zoom, the judiciary uses Cisco WebEx. So one member of the public who wants to go to the DEI community forum we did with the judiciary 2 weeks ago is gonna sign into that on Cisco WebEx. And then the next day, they're gonna come and watch your committee hearing in Zoom. And then later that day, they're gonna sit in a meeting with me in Teams. And if they don't know how to use all of those things, what do we have for them? So our recommendations are as follows. Number one, you can either choose one platform to use across all three branches, or publish really detailed guides on how to use each of those and make them publicly accessible. The next recommendation is to distribute a link that has
Can we
the.
just go with number one?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and say no, Senator Hardy, and we'll talk later about why. Because that could take up a whole hour.
Sorry to interrupt.
There's the first disagreement.
We were nice and down.
We were on a roll.
That wasn't personal at all.
I'm impressed you're so open to any other. So much better.
I should note here that we're talking about a comparison between the three platforms. Several people, particularly in the disability justice community, have identified that there is a preferred one that tends to have the most accessibility, and that one is Zoom Gov, which is the particular government organ for Zoom. The next recommendation we have is distributing a link to the software guide. If we choose to make one, I think we should either way. But distributing a link to that whenever we set up a video meeting with members of the public. So for example, what would that look like for the legislature? That would mean in addition to having your Zoom link published on your agenda, it would also have a link to the video conferencing guide for those who are joining via Zoom. And then the last one here is the translating video conferencing software guides. So we make a guide, we make it public and put it out with all our notices, and we translate it.
And the judiciary branch has a guide for WebEx that is in English, but it's a really good guide. So we've got a head start on the judiciary branch there already.
All right.
So they just need to translate the English guide.
We're going to start rushing even more than we have been because we are close to time, but I think there are also questions.
Just a quick question. Is WebEx used by the judiciary because it's the most secure?
I really don't know, Representative.
So what I would say is any of these questions that are related to IT, we're definitely going to dive into when we have ADS back. I have like a running list that going. So definitely that is a great question, Representative Murwicki, and we will talk to IT at Judiciary and some of our colleagues from ADS about some of those choices, which is why I was so quick to answer no to Senator Hardy's question.
Are you doing an ADS bill?
All right. Our next finding actually is one that we've already said in the last one, which is that community feedback and other national research identified Zoom/ZoomGov as the one that seems to have the most comprehensive features to satisfy these purposes. Our recommendation here is to consider having the Zoom account. If we don't have a unified platform across all the branches, then in addition to creating a guide that is translated and made public, we would consider purchasing paid ZoomGov accounts on an as-needed basis for departments who may have frequent interactions with clients or communities who require additional language access services. The other recommendation is to refer to the discussion that we have in this report about best practices for using video conferencing software. That's Appendix B. Next one begins our discussion in the topic of professional development and qualifications. So the first one here is that we know that national vendors offer interpreters who don't always understand things like local place names or geographic features or other things that are really Vermont specific. So what we'd like to recommend is implementing a job training program or some other initiative that helps to recruit additional interpreters and translators to Vermont so that we can increase the supply of locally knowledgeable people. I will also note we have a population of people who are multicultural, multilingual, often immigrants, who come to Vermont, get settled, and then leave after a few years because there's little opportunity here for them or little sense of community. This has everything to do with housing affordability This has everything to do with job training. This has everything to do with xenophobia. We have to tackle all those other upstream factors. And also, we see this as one potential mechanism that could help keep people in the state. Have a training program that allows them to utilize the language skills they already bring with them. Next recommendation is to increase compensation to any state contracted language assistance service providers. We've been getting a lot of emergency COVID-related work at a discounted rate from our providers, and we would really like to take a breather and look at what is prevailing wage, what is going to keep the profession effective and supported in the state, and to reconsider that. Still in professional development and qualifications, next finding is that there's not enough consistency in the quality of language access services we're getting. So we're recommending establishing a statewide translation and interpretation licensure or certification program. I know someone watching this right now virtually is throwing paper at me at the screen because we got a lot of mixed feedback about this one. We heard from people in the industry, people who are translators and interpreters, both in Vermont and who have operated outside the state, who have told us that the creation of a licensure program will actually make the interpreter pool shrink, mainly because there are certain barriers to entry to the profession. For example, there are some folks for whom it may be prohibitively expensive to obtain and maintain a license. We've also heard from other people that, some people may reach certification level, but not necessarily licensure level. And also that sometimes if you have a minimum standard, let's say we only want people who are licensed, who speak a particular language, but the only people in Vermont who can do it maybe are certified but not licensed, it means you may have a person who could be qualified, but who doesn't meet the technical credentialing qualification. And so that may end up limiting our ability to utilize their services. So it's after a lot of deep consideration and a lot of rocking back and forth and hand wringing that we make this recommendation that we do think we need to have a strong and predictable standard for the quality of the product that people are receiving in the state. If you're in a medical setting, a legal setting, any kind of setting, your life or your well-being could depend on it. So we do think that a licensure program is appropriate. And what we'd like to do to support the interpreter pool and the translator pool is to help to reduce barriers through that licensure process so that we don't end up having a negative impact on the profession. I will pause there. That was a lot.
Representative Chase.
What do other states and the feds do?
It's a mess.
Okay.
Yeah. I
Inconsistent. Yeah, some have just certification, which kind of means people can say, yep, I'm an interpreter, put me on the list. And I don't mean to oversimplify it, but
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. Yeah. That's what I thought you were alluding to.
Yeah. And then you have some who do have robust licensure programs. And again, if we're talking about Spanish, Polish, Italian, French, perhaps it's really easy to have a large and rotating roster. But for Vermont, we really struggle to have a reliable and predictable pool for people who speak the languages that we need. So that may be a challenge. And then in other places, you have systems that really don't have much of anything at all, or they rely on the national vendors, right? The telelanguage, the language line, et cetera.
Yeah. There's also organizations like the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. I believe that's what the RID stands for. And they have national guidelines, and if someone is registered with them, it means that they meet certain qualification standards, but it's inconsistent.
The second recommendation we have here is to develop a complaint procedure so that anytime a state employee gets a complaint regarding the quality of the services, of the language services that we contracted for, in other words, anytime we provide someone an interpreter or a translator and they mess up, we need to have a complaint procedure so that we can know about it. We note that licensure or certification programs can create barriers to entering the profession. We mentioned this already. So we recommend that any licensure or certification program should be designed to remove those barriers, which may mean subsidizing the cost of a license or finding other solutions to help people remain in or enter the profession. We also note that a lot of testing or professional exam materials aren't translated. And this doesn't just mean for language service providers. It also could be for your CDL that one is translated, but there are a lot of professional exams that are not. So we recommend providing educational materials and tests for jobs that require licensing, but that don't require English language proficiency. right? So translate the test if for the job, you need to take the test, but you don't really need to speak English. While we're here, I just want to remind everybody that we should check on Reg 29. I'm not sure if that is.
Oh, no, they did submit the ICAR form to get that removed.
Okay, never mind, carry on. Okay, we're almost there. We're now entering the section of the findings that pertain specifically to ADA compliance. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and relates to accessibility. So we said earlier that we worked really closely and are really grateful for the assistance of the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. We see disability access as inextricably linked to language access. And for that reason, we've identified a number of recommendations related to ADA compliance that we think will be of use. The first is that a lot of assistive technologies may not be able to help you get access to a website if the website itself isn't designed to work with assistive technology reader. So our recommendation here is to audit every state website for accessibility for anyone who relies on assistive technology, such as, but not limited to, screen readers. Another finding here is that all of our state websites are designed based on an accessible template in general, but when you add content or make changes to the website, it sometimes breaks the accessibility of the general template that we were working on. So we're recommending performing an accessibility audit anytime a state's web content is added or updated. Now, for some websites or some departments, that's really easy because they rarely change things. And for others, I can identify ACCD, Department of Health. They're making changes all the time. And so we want to find something that is effective and accessible, but also not so burdensome that you've got a person whose full-time job it is just to look for any change to the website. Next one is that few state websites have notices about the availability of disability accessibility accommodations. So we are recommending creating a dedicated link on every state homepage that discusses accessibility resources. That may be something like, hey, if you can't get what you need online, you need to come to our office. This is the office. Maybe that means this is the building map. Here's where the ramps are, right? I mean, things that you want to know when you go somewhere. We're also recommending investing the resources that are necessary to ensure ADA compliance in our offices, which means things like making sure that the lighting is on point, making sure that the building entrances and exits are accessible. Are your doorways 42 inches? Things like that. We're also recommending translating the links to these resources into languages other than English. We know that people who speak other languages also may have disabilities, and so it's not one or the other, right? You've got a lot of intersection there. Almost done. Important public service announcements are seldom translated into ASL or other signed languages, so our recommendation is to translate all of these into ASL. We're recommending not relying on automated captioning for videos. Instead, use live or manually translated captioning services. If we are relying on automated captioning, let's review it for errors and correct them before we distribute the video publicly. And let's add open captions in English in addition to closed captions whenever possible. We also know that there are currently no hearing loop systems installed in any of the state-owned or leased buildings, which means that anybody who's an employee or a member of the public who's not an employee with hearing loss can't fully participate in events being held. So we're recommending that we create a plan for addressing communication access in the state buildings for people with hearing loss. There is one more. I am now on page 30. This is a recommendation that is it's revived from the Racial Equity Task Force's second or first report, and it recommends that we do a needs assessment, a school level needs assessment for multilingual liaisons in schools who are critical parts of the community and yet are often overlooked and undercompensated, and also too few in number. So we're recommending doing a school level needs assessment so that we can understand how many districts have or need multilingual liaisons, understand how we can support people in those roles, and looking at pay parity and other ways that we can support the professional group as well. Those are the findings. I'm just going to do quickly next steps and then I'm done because you have a hard stop, so I have to be done.
We are not done this conversation though, when we adjourn today. So if you want to tell us the next steps before us House members have to get up to the floor, that'd be great.
So next steps, you'll see kind of a timeline of where we are to date. Right now, of course, we are in the policy generating process. So we are hopeful that this report is going to inform good, unified policy across all the branches of state government. And after this, if the legislature does create, if the legislature and the executive can come to agreement on the budget for this, then we look forward to taking the next steps towards implementation, which means gathering any additional data we weren't able to get during the research process, and then beginning to carve out minimum plans, beginning to coordinate who are going to be the designees in the various departments we need, and being able to come up with a realistic timeline that incorporates our needs, the sense of urgency, and also the capacity of our in-state and out-of-state providers. So thank you so much for your time. We are happy to stay as long as you are willing.
Mr. Chair, I just have a quick question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of the next steps, on your thing, it said to revise the bill or the policy. Are you referring to S-147 from last session, or are you referring to the budget, the language and the appropriations that is in the governor's budget?
No, when we say refine a bill or policy, we really just mean create or refine one. So we're not wedded to the language that was in S-147. We've already included a draft model minimum in our report, and we'd like for that to serve. And I think a lot of the language from the report can serve as the basis of any policy that we generate. So I think we have the answers. We just got to.
Okay, I just want clarity on what you're asking us to do or needing us to do in this legislative session beyond the funding that's in the budget. So
Yeah.
maybe you and I can talk about that.
I would say don't stop at just this presentation. Please read the full report. There's a lot more detail that we didn't have time to get into in the full report that will answer a lot of those questions of what requires a new policy versus what is existing versus,
Thank you.
It sounds like next step is our work.
I will say to answer the other part of your question, which is what else in addition to budget, one of the things that we mentioned in the report, but we didn't budget for specifically is this is a really big lift. And there are some unanswered questions. For example, the question of how will this be coordinated? Will it be centralized or decentralized? If decentralized, what additional staffing resources are departments going to have to do this? Or other branches of government going to have to do this kind of work? We did not even touch the issue of what constitutes vital documents for the legislature because you all are pumping out documents every minute of the day. If the work is centralized, if the work is centralized, then we have to identify who's going to be doing it and have a realistic analysis of whether they can do it with existing resources. So I think that is another issue that we would ask you all to consider.
So is your 3.5 include the administrative work of some staff? I mean, of the, like DMV, do you have a notion of what, Department of Motor Vehicle?
There's a whole disclaimer about what that 3.5 million does and does not include in that report. I just wanted to say that before everyone knows. But yeah, the answer is no.
Bill on the floor, so I definitely want to pause this conversation.